A widower's silent cabin, haunted by loss, shelters a wounded stranger fleeing danger. As hoofprints circle the snow, their fragile bond faces a reckoning that could ignite or heal their hearts. Welcome to Life Bond Tales. Like and share this. Video thee those who need love. Elias Holt stood at the frost-rimed window of his Nebraska cabin, his calloused hands gripping the sill as the winter dusk bled into the horizon. At 45, his broad shoulders bore the weight of 4 lonely years since Clara, his wife, succumbed to fever in a storm that buried their unborn son with her beneath a gnarled oak by the creek. The plain stretched endless before him, a sea of snow and shadow, mirroring the silence that had settled into his bones. His greying hair fell across a furrowed brow, and his eyes, once bright with purpose, now traced the land with a quiet ache. The cabin, a weathered shell of pine and memory, held Clara's traces everywhere. A quilt draped over a chair, its stitches unraveling like their dreams, a tin of chamomile tea she'd loved, untouched on a shelf, and an embroidery hoop with half-formed roses gathering dust. Elias lived alone, not by choice but by necessity. His voice rusted from disuse, speaking only to his horse or the wind that howled like grief itself. He'd been a field medic in the Civil War, stitching wounds under cannon fire, but no skill could mend the hole Clara left. The townsfolk in nearby Willow Creek called him the Quiet Man, a shadow who rode in monthly for flour and salt, his words as sparse as the coins he traded. Some whispered he'd gone soft in the head, others swore he'd always been a ghost even before her death. That evening, as the sky bruised purple, a sound pierced the stillness, not the moan of wind or the snap of a branch, but something raw, halting, alive. Elias froze, his breath clouding the glass, and reached for the lantern by the door. Stepping into the biting cold, his boots crunched on snow, and he followed the sound to the barn where a cedar tree loomed like a sentinel. There, curled against its roots, lay a young woman, her dark hair matted with frost, her Lakota dress torn at the thigh, blood seeping into the snow. She was no older than 20, her face pale but fierce, even in collapse, like a deer caught in a trap yet unyielding. Elias stood motionless, his heart thudding, unsure if she was real or a spectre born of his solitude. Her shallow breaths proved her flesh, and without a word he knelt, his rough hands gentle as he lifted her, light as a memory, her skin cold but pulsing with life. He carried her inside, the cabin's warmth a stark contrast to the frost on her lashes, and laid her near the hearth, wrapping her in a blanket that hadn't touched skin since Clara's last winter. As he stoked the fire, its glow caught the sharp lines of her face, revealing a gash on her leg, deep but not mortal, and the shadow of fear in her half-open eyes. Elias didn't ask her name or story. He only moved with the quiet precision of a man who knew wounds, fetching water and cloth to clean the blood. His hands steady despite the storm, her presence stirred within him. She stirred faintly, her lips parting in a murmur he couldn't pass, a language of wind and earth, perhaps, Lakota, carrying a weight he felt but couldn't name. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Elias sat in his chair watching the flames, not her, his heart wrestling with a truth. This stranger had brought something alive into his dead world, and he wasn't sure if he feared it or craved it. The cabin's hearth cast flickering shadows as dawn broke, pale light seeping through the shutters to reveal Kiona awake, her dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk tracking movement. Elias, already up, stirred a pot of coffee, his movements deliberate, avoiding her gaze not out of fear but to give her space, sensing the wariness in her rigid posture. Her Lakota dress, stained and torn, clung to her frame, the bandage on her leg now stiff with dried blood, yet she sat upright on the blanket by the fire, her hands folded tightly as if holding herself together. She reached for the cornbread Elias had left on a tin plate, her fingers quick but cautious, like a fox testing a trap. He sat at the table, cradling his mug, the steam curling like a question neither dared to ask. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met his briefly, holding neither gratitude nor hostility, only a guarded acknowledgement of their shared space. Outside, the snow had thickened, blanketing the Nebraska plains in a silence that felt both protective and oppressive, trapping them in this fragile moment. Elias noticed the way she glanced at the door, her body tensing at every creak of the wind, as if expecting pursuit. He wanted to ask who she was running from, but the weight of her silence held him back. A silence that spoke of more than fear. It was the kind carved by betrayal or loss. Instead, he rose, checked the fire, and stepped outside to tend the livestock, his boots sinking into the fresh snow. The air bit at his knuckles, but he welcomed it, a distraction from the unfamiliar pulse of another's presence in his home. When he returned, Kiona had moved, standing by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the white expanse. Elias caught the faint tremble in her hands, not from cold, but from something deeper, a story she wasn't ready to share. He cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse, and said, "You're safe here for now." His voice felt foreign, like a tool he'd forgotten how to wield. She didn't respond, but her shoulders eased slightly, a sign she'd heard him. The day passed in quiet tension, each keeping to their own tasks. Elias splitting wood, Kiona sweeping the hearth with a broom she'd found leaning against the wall. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if claiming a small piece of the space for herself. Elias noticed how she avoided Clara's quilt, still draped over the chair as if sensing its weight of memory. By dusk, the storm had worsened, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts rattling the cabin's bones. Elias offered her the bed, a simple pine frame he hadn't touched since Clara, and took the chair for himself, insisting it was practical, not kind. The bed was warmer, closer to the fire. Kiona accepted without a word, her eyes lingering on him, searching for intent he didn't fully understand himself. In the night, he woke to find her standing at the window again, her silhouette sharp against the firelight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He rose, the floor creaking under his weight, and asked, "You expecting trouble?" Her head turned, her eyes catching his, and after a long pause, she nodded once, a gesture heavy with unspoken truths. Elias felt a chill that wasn't from the cold, a sense that her trouble wasn't just hers but now his, woven into the fabric of this cabin. He draped Clara's second blanket over her shoulders, careful not to touch her, and returned to his chair, staring into the flames. The fire's crackle was the only sound, but it couldn't drown out the questions circling his mind. Who was she running from? And why had she landed here, in a place where grief had long been the only guest? Kiona's presence was a storm, of its own, not loud but forceful, stirring dust in corners of his heart he'd boarded shut. He told himself she'd leave when the snow cleared, that this was temporary, a brief ripple in his solitude. Yet as he watched her settle back by the fire, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket, he felt a tug, a faint hope he didn't dare name. The cabin, once a tomb for his past, now held a stranger who breathed life into its walls. And Elias wasn't sure if he was ready to let that life take root, or if he'd push it away to preserve the quiet he'd grown to know. The wind outside sang of secrets, and within, two souls stood at the edge of something neither could yet define, bound by a silence that was no longer empty, but alive with possibility. The snowstorm held the Nebraska plains in a relentless grip, sealing Elias Holt and Kiona in the cabin like two seeds buried in winter earth. Their days took on a rhythm of shared survival, each task a thread weaving a fragile trust between them. Kiona, her leg wound slowly healing, began to claim small corners of the space, stacking kindling with care, or grinding coffee beans with a mortar Elias hadn't touched in years. Her hands, though calloused from a life of labor, moved with a grace that spoke of purpose, as if each act was a quiet defiance of the fear that lingered in her eyes. Elias, in turn, worked outside, his breath clouding as he mended a sagging fence or broke ice from the horse trough. But his mind stayed tethered to the cabin, to the woman who filled its silence with a presence he couldn't ignore. One morning, as he returned with an armful of wood, he found Kiona kneeling by the hearth, her fingers tracing the charred edge of a log, her face lost in thought. She looked up and asked, "What was her name?" The question landed like a stone, in still water, rippling through Elias's guarded heart. "Clara," he said, his voice low, the word tasting of dust and memory. Kiona nodded, her gaze softening, and said no more. But later that day, she gently moved Clara's embroidery hoop to a shelf, handling it like a relic, a gesture that felt like respect rather than intrusion. That evening, over a sparse meal, of beans and cornbread, Kiona spoke, her words careful but deliberate. She'd fled her Lakota band to escape a marriage arranged to seal a truce with a rival group, a man whose hands were heavy with expectation and little else. Her leg wound came from a struggle when she refused him, a blade catching her as she broke free and ran through the night, guided only by starlight and desperation. Elias listened, his fork still, his chest tight with a mix of anger and admiration for her courage. He shared a piece of his own past, how he'd stitched soldiers together in the war, only to come home and fail to save Clara from fever, her body too weak to carry their son. The words spilled slow, each one a weight lifted, and Kiona's eyes held his, not with pity but with recognition, as if she too knew what it was to carry loss like a shadow. Outside, the storm began to ease, but a new tension crept in. Elias spotted tracks in the snow, not deep but fresh, hoofprints circling the cabin at a distance, too orderly to be random. He didn't tell Kiona at first, but her sharp gaze caught his unease as he lingered by the window, scanning the horizon. "They're looking for me," she said, not a question, her voice steady but laced with resolve. She confirmed her father, Chief Tawa, led a band of Lakota warriors, men bound by duty to retrieve her, not out of love, but because her absence broke a fragile peace. Elias felt the air shift, the cabin no longer a sanctuary, but a stage for a reckoning he hadn't chosen. He asked, "Will they come soon?" Kiona's eyes darkened, but she stood taller. "They'll wait for the snow to thin, but not long. My father doesn't forgive defiance." The words hung between them, heavy, as the axe Elias set by the door, not for violence but for readiness. That night, as the fire burned low, Kiona wove a strip of leather into a bracelet, her fingers deft, her focus absolute, as if creating something could hold the world at bay. Elias watched, struck by how her hands seemed to speak what her voice held back, a story of resilience, of a woman who'd run not from weakness but from a life that tried to cage her. He found himself splitting extra wood, leaving it near the hearth for her, a wordless offering that felt like more than practicality. She noticed her fingers pausing over the leather and offered a small nod, a gesture that carried the weight of a thank you neither needed to speak. Their silence had changed, no longer a wall but a bridge built from shared glances and small acts of care. Elias lay awake in his chair, the bed still Kiona's, his mind tracing the hoofprints outside, wondering if he was ready to face what they meant. Kiona too lay still, her breathing steady but her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling as if mapping her own path forward. The cabin held them both, its walls no longer just a shelter, but a space where two broken souls began to mend, not by erasing their pasts, but by sharing the weight of them. The tracks outside were a warning, a promise of a confrontation that would test their fragile bond, but for now they had this moment, this quiet, and the unspoken vow to face whatever came together. The dawn broke sharp and brittle, the Nebraska sky a taut grey canvas, as if the world held its breath for what was coming. Elias Holt stood on the porch, his hands tight around a tin mug, the coffee within long gone cold, his eyes locked on the horizon where the hoofprints from days before had faded, but not vanished. Kiona moved inside, her steps deliberate as she tied her dark hair into a tight braid, her Lakota tunic now mended with thread Elias had found in a forgotten drawer, her bandaged leg steady despite the faint limp. The air was thick with waiting, the kind that presses against the chest, and when the low thunder of hooves finally rose, it felt less like a surprise and more like fate unfolding. Elias set the mug down, his jaw tight, and stepped into the yard, Kiona following without a word, her presence a quiet force beside him. The Lakota warriors crested the ridge, their horses moving in a disciplined line, not charging but claiming the ground with every step. Chief Tawa led them, his broad frame draped in a cloak of elk hide, his face painted with ochre streaks that cut like scars across his cheeks. His eyes, dark and unyielding, found Kiona first, then Elias, measuring the man who stood between him and his daughter. The warriors fanned out, their silence louder than any war cry, their spears lowered but ready. Tawa dismounted, his boots crunching in the thinning snow, and spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of tradition. "You have had your time. She returns now." Elias stepped forward, his hands loose at his sides, his voice steady despite the pulse hammering in his throat. "She's not yours to take. She's her own." Kiona moved beside him, her chin high, her gaze unflinching. "I will not go, father," she said, each word carved with conviction. "I chose this place." A murmur rippled through the warriors, their faces stone but their eyes flickering with something like disbelief. Tawa's expression hardened, his hand resting on the hilt of a bone-handled knife at his belt. "You defy blood, daughter. You break what binds us." Kiona's voice didn't waver. "I break what chains me." The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade, and for a moment the only sound was the wind stirring the prairie grass. Tawa's gaze shifted to Elias, searching for weakness, finding instead a man who stood rooted not in defiance but in resolve. He spoke again, his tone shifting to something ceremonial, almost sacred. "A man who shelters a daughter must prove his worth, not with blood but with honor. Hunt with me. One buffalo, one path. Show me you can carry her weight." Elias met his eyes, feeling the challenge settle into his bones, knowing refusal could spark a violence neither wanted. He nodded once, a gesture as binding as a vow. Kiona's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that said she trusted him to face this, not for her, but with her. The warriors parted as Tawa led Elias to the horses, handing him a bow, its wood, worn smooth by years of use. They rode into the low hills, the sagebrush brittle underfoot, the air heavy with the scent of earth and coming rain. The hunt was silent, each man moving with purpose, tracking a buffalo whose tracks cut deep into the frost. Elias felt the weight of Tawa's scrutiny, but also the rhythm of the land, the same rhythm he'd once shared with Clara when they walked these hills. The buffalo appeared, a massive bull, its breath steaming in the cold, its eyes wild but steady. Tawa gestured for Elias to take the shot, a test not of skill but of heart. Elias drew the bow, his hand steady from years of stitching wounds under pressure, and loosed the arrow, striking clean through the beast's flank. It fell with a heavy thud, and Tawa's nod was slow, grudging, but real. They returned to the cabin, the buffalo's hide slung across Tawa's horse, a silent testament to the moment. The warriors waited, their faces unreadable, but the tension had shifted, no longer a noose but a thread stretched taut. Tawa dismounted and faced Kiona, his voice softer now, though still heavy. "You are not mine to command, but you are still my daughter." He touched her forehead, a gesture of farewell, not possession, then turned to Elias. "You do not know our ways, but you walk with truth. That is enough for today." He mounted again, and the warriors followed, their departure as quiet as their arrival, leaving only churned snow and a fading hoofbeat. Kiona stood beside Elias, her shoulders easing, but her eyes distant, as if seeing both the life she'd left and the one she'd chosen. Elias felt the air lighten, but not fully, the weight of Tawa's parting words lingering. There could be another day, another reckoning. Inside, the cabin felt different, the fire's warmth no longer just a shield against cold, but a space where two lives could begin to intertwine. Kiona sat by the hearth, her hands still, her face a map of relief and resolve. Elias joined her, not speaking, but feeling the shift in their shared silence, now a place of possibility rather than retreat. The world outside was still, the storm, clouds parting to reveal a sliver of sky, and in that moment they both knew they'd crossed a threshold not to safety, but to something worth fighting for. The Nebraska plains exhaled as winter loosened its grip, the snow melting into patches that gleamed under a tentative spring sun, casting the cabin in a softer light. Elias, Holt, and Kiona moved through their days with a new rhythm, their bond growing like roots finding purchase in once barren soil. Kiona's hands, now free of bandages, worked with purpose, stitching a new tunic from the blue cotton Elias had kept in a trunk, her needle flashing in the morning light as she sat by the open window. Elias, his graying hair tied back, repaired, a loose shutter, his hammer strike steady, each one a quiet promise to build something lasting. Their conversations, once sparse, began to bloom. Kiona spoke of the stars her mother taught her to read, each constellation a story of ancestors, while Elias shared how he'd once dreamed of planting an orchard, a plan abandoned when Clara's laughter faded. One evening, as the fire cast golden shadows, Kiona wove a basket from willow reeds, her fingers deft, and Elias, watching, offered her a strip of rawhide, saying, "For the handle, if you want it." She smiled, a rare curve of her lips that warmed him more than the hearth, and wove it in, their hands brushing briefly, a touch that lingered in the air. The cabin, once a shrine to loss, now hummed with life, its walls holding the scent of sage Kiona burned to cleanse the space, a ritual that felt like a new beginning. But the world beyond the cabin loomed, and Elias knew they couldn't stay, cocooned forever. He needed supplies, flour, nails, a new axe head, and Kiona, sensing his intent, insisted on riding with him to Willow Creek. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice firm, her eyes daring him to argue. Elias nodded, feeling a mix of pride and unease, knowing the town's eyes would judge them both. They rode side by side, the horses' hooves kicking up dust on the sun-baked trail, Kiona's braid swaying against her back, her posture unyielding despite the weight of stairs they'd face. Willow Creek was a cluster of clapboard buildings, its streets alive with the clatter of wagons and the murmur of gossip. Mrs. Werner, the shopkeeper, stood in her doorway, her arms crossed, her lips a thin line as she watched them dismount. Her eyes raked over Kiona's tunic, the sage bundle tied at her waist, and then flicked to Elias, searching for a story she could pin down. "You're back, Holt," she said, her tone sharp. "And with company." Elias met her gaze, his voice even. "She's not company. She's Kiona." The store was quiet, the air thick with the curiosity of a half-dozen townsfolk pausing over barrels of salt and sugar. Kiona stood tall, her presence a quiet challenge, and when a man muttered Lakota under his breath, she turned, her eyes locking onto his until he looked away. Elias picked out their goods. Coffee, a bolt of linen, a small jar of honey, his. Hands steady but his heart racing, aware of every whisper. At the counter, Mrs. Werner leaned forward, her voice low. "Folks won't take kindly to this, Elias. You know how they talk." Before he could respond, Kiona spoke, her words clear, cutting through the hush. "Let them talk. I chose this life." The room stilled, and Mrs. Werner blinked, her mouth opening then closing, no retort ready. Elias felt a surge of something, fierce, not anger but respect, and as they turned to leave, he said, "We'll be married come spring." The words landed like a spark in dry grass, igniting murmurs. But Kiona didn't flinch, her hand brushing his as they stepped outside, a gesture that anchored him against the town's judgment. Back at the cabin, the evening air was soft, scented with blooming prairie flowers. Elias carved a small wooden hawk, its wings spread, and left it on the table for Kiona, a gift that said what words couldn't. She found it at dusk, her fingers tracing its curves, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his chest ache. Later, as they sat by the fire, she sang a Lakota lullaby, her voice low, weaving a melody of rivers and wind. Elias listened, his hands still on a piece of leather he was softening, feeling the song settle into him like rain into earth. Their bond was not yet love, but something deeper, a recognition of two souls who'd walked through fire and found each other on the other side. Kiona began to leave her mark on the cabin, hanging a woven reed mat by the door, its patterns echoing. The stars she'd described. Elias, in turn, cleared a patch of land near the creek, not for an orchard yet, but for herbs Kiona wanted to plant, a shared dream, taking root. The town's whispers lingered in his mind, but so did Kiona's strength, her choice to stand beside him, and he knew they were building something no gossip could unravel. As the stars emerged, bright against the velvet sky, Elias felt a lightness he hadn't known in years, a sense that the cabin was no longer a grave, but a home. Spring unfurled across the Nebraska plains, painting the grasslands with wildflowers, hand-warming the creek where Elias Holt and Kiona stood, their hands joined in a quiet ceremony under the oak that had once marked only loss. Their marriage was a blend of vows spoken in English and Lakota, the words mingling with the rush of water, and the call of a meadowlark, a promise sealed not by law but by choice. Kiona wore a tunic she'd woven, its blue cotton threaded with white beads that caught the sunlight, while Elias, his shirt patched but clean, felt his heart steady for the first time in years, as if the earth itself had exhaled. The cabin, once a hollow shell, now pulsed with life. Herbs sprouted in a garden Kiona tended, their sharp scents of sage and mint drifting through open windows, blending with the wood smoke from the hearth. Elias worked beside her, his hands learning the rhythm of planting, his calluses softening under her guidance as they pressed seeds into soil still damp from spring rains. Their nights were filled with shared stories, Kiona recounting tales of Lakota spirits who danced in the aurora, Elias describing the constellations he'd traced as a boy, their voices weaving a tapestry of past and present. One morning, Kiona carved a small antler pendant, etching it with a crescent moon, and hung it above the door, a symbol of protection and new beginnings. Elias, in turn, built a bench by the creek, its wood smoothed by his hands, a place for them to sit and watch the water carve its slow path. The town of Willow Creek began to shift, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways. Mrs. Verner, once sharp-tongued, set aside a spool of thread for Kiona's weaving, her nod a grudging olive branch. A young girl, no older than 10, approached Kiona at the market, her eyes wide with curiosity, asking to learn the art of beadwork, and Kiona taught her, her hands patient as the girl fumbled with the needle. Elias watched these moments, his chest swelling with a pride that felt like sunlight after a long winter. The cabin's walls, once heavy with Clara's absence, now held new marks, Kiona's woven mats, a shelf of dried herbs she'd gathered, a pair of moccasins she'd crafted for Elias, their soles soft but sturdy. He found himself carving again, not just tools but small figures, a horse, a bird, a tiny cradle he worked on in secret, his knife moving with a care he hadn't felt since before his loss. Kiona's belly began to curve, a gentle swell that spoke of life growing within her, and Elias, seeing it, felt a hope so sharp it bordered on pain. They spoke of the child in quiet moments, not with grand plans, but with small dreams. A name, yet to be chosen, a blanket Kiona began to weave, its threads dyed with prairie berries. One evening, as the sky burned gold and crimson, Kiona stood by the oak, her hand resting on its bark, her eyes closed, as if listening to the tree's heartbeat. Elias joined her, his hand finding hers, and she said, "This is where I landed and where I chose to stay." Her words carried the weight of their journey, from her collapse in the snow to this moment of rootedness. Elias nodded, his throat tight, and whispered, "And I'm glad you did." Their life was not without shadows. The memory of Chief Tawa's departure lingered, a reminder that her people might return, not as enemies, but as a past that still claimed a piece of her. Yet Kiona faced this with the same resolve she'd shown before, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes fierce with the knowledge that this child would know both her heritage and the life she'd chosen. Elias, too, carried his past, but it no longer felt like a chain. Clara's memory was a quiet presence, honored in the herbs Kiona planted, in the quilt they now used together. The town's acceptance grew slowly. A farmer offered Elias extra seed for their garden. A woman at the store smiled at Kiona instead of staring. One night, as they sat by the fire, Kiona's hand found Elias's, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm, and she said, "You gave me a home, not just a roof." He looked at her, his eyes soft, and replied, "You gave me a reason to live in it." The fire crackled, its warmth wrapping them in a cocoon of light, and outside, the stars burned bright, a map of all they'd endured and all they'd built. Their love, born not of grand gestures but of shared silences and chosen moments, was a fire that needed no fuel but their presence. The cradle Elias finished stood by the hearth, its wood polished to a soft glow, waiting for the life it would hold. Kiona placed the pendant she'd carved beside it, a quiet blessing, and as they stood together the cabin felt like a world entire, a place where two souls, once adrift, had found anchor in each other.